The moment I stepped through those double doors, I heard him say it. "Well, look who found a parking spot big enough for that truck." He said it to the room, not to me, and the room laughed like he'd said something clever. My daughter's fiancé, Preston Hale, stood there in a suit that probably cost more than my tractor payment, grinning like he'd just won something. I stopped walking. Nobody in that room said a word in my defense. Not one person. They just watched me get sized up and dismissed in front of 40 guests, then looked away and went back to their champagne like nothing had happened. And that silence was the loudest thing I'd heard in years. My name is Robert Callahan. Everyone who's known me longer than 5 minutes calls me Bob. I'm 66 years old, and I've spent the last 38 of those years running a feed and grain supply out of a little town called Mill Haven, Ohio, 40 minutes past anywhere you'd call a city. My father started that business with a single truck and a line of credit the bank almost didn't give him. I took it over when he couldn't lift 50-pound bags anymore, and I built it into something that puts 3 families to work besides my own. I buried my wife, Carol, 4 years ago after a fight with cancer that she handled with more grace than I've handled anything in my life. I raised one daughter on that same stretch of road, and the night I'm telling you about, she was getting engaged, and I'd ironed my good shirt twice because I wanted to look like a man who belonged in that ballroom. 10 seconds after walking in, I knew I didn't. The man who made the joke was named Preston Hale, my daughter's fiancé. Standing beside him, laughing along like it was the funniest thing she'd heard all week, was his mother, Vivian. A couple of the other guests glanced my way, saw that I'd heard every word clearly, and looked away fast, suddenly very interested in their drinks. That's the part nobody talks about when they talk about public humiliation. It's not that people join in, it's that they watch it happen and let it happen, and then they pick their conversation back up like the air in the room hadn't changed at all. I felt my jaw tighten. I looked down at my boots, the ones I'd polished that morning, and for one ugly second, I saw them the way he must have seen them. Worn, wrong, out of place. 38 years of honest work, and somehow a stranger's laugh had made all of it feel small. I turned toward the door. I was actually leaving. And then a hand landed on my shoulder. Dad, my daughter, Emily. She came up close and dropped her voice so only I could hear it. "Please, just tonight. Trust me." That was it. No explanation. 6 words and a look in her eyes I didn't recognize. Not nerves, not embarrassment, something steadier, like a woman holding on to a secret she wasn't ready to let go of yet. I stayed for her, not because I wanted to be in that room one more minute, not because those people had earned my patience, but because in 26 years my daughter had never once given me a reason to doubt her. If you've ever swallowed something that hurt you because someone you loved asked you to hold on a little longer, you know exactly how heavy that silence felt walking back into the party. I spent the rest of the evening smiling on command, shaking hands, answering the same 3 questions about the feed store from people who'd clearly rehearsed them as small talk. But every so often I caught Vivian's eyes moving over me, not toward my face, toward my hands, my boots, the cut of my jacket. The same look people give you when they've already written your whole biography before you've said a single word to them. Here's the strange part. I wasn't ashamed of my life. I owned my building outright. I didn't owe a nickel to anybody. And yet somehow, every time the Hale family was in a room, the ordinary things about me started to feel small. I found myself thinking about Carol that night. My wife had a gift for reading people the way some folks read weather. She'd catch a smile that landed half a second too fast, a compliment aimed a little too precisely. She was hardly ever wrong. It's been 4 years, and I still catch myself wondering what she would have made of Preston in the first 30 seconds of meeting him. Honestly, I already knew the answer. I just hadn't wanted to hear it. Because the truth is, my unease about Preston hadn't started that night. It started almost 2 years earlier, the first time Emily brought him out to the feed store to meet me. He was polished, quick with a compliment, dressed like he'd stepped out of a catalog. My daughter looked happy, and God help me, that was enough for me at the time. So I welcomed him, walked him through the property, introduced him to the Delacroix family who ran the hardware store next door. But on that first visit, I noticed something that never quite left me. Most people who walk a piece of property ask questions because they're curious. Preston asked questions like he was building a spreadsheet. Square footage, zoning, whether the county had any development plans filed for the corridor along Route 9. I told myself it was just his job. He worked in commercial real estate, so of course he thought in those terms. Looking back now, I think I was giving myself an excuse not to look at the real answer. Meeting his parents made it worse. His father, Gerald Hale, talked like every room he walked into already belonged to him. Investments, acquisitions, deals he'd seen coming before anyone else. Vivian was smoother, harder to read than her husband, somehow. Every sentence out of her mouth sounded like it had been rehearsed in front of a mirror. Never a direct insult. People like that don't insult you outright. They just ask questions designed to remind you of the gap between your world and theirs. How's the margin on livestock feed these days, Bob? Ever think about selling and doing something easier on your back? Every conversation felt less like getting to know family and more like sitting through an audit I never agreed to. But Emily was happy. So every time my gut told me something was off, I told myself I was an overprotective old man still grieving his wife, seeing shadows where there weren't any. Standing in that ballroom that night, replaying Preston's joke over and over, I finally admitted something I'd been avoiding for 2 years. I hadn't been suspicious enough of that family. Less than 2 hours later, my daughter was going to prove me right. Dinner wrapped up a little after 9. Valets ran cars back and forth out front. The ballroom thinned out slow, that shuffling exit that every engagement party seems to have. I was looking forward to getting back to my hotel room and trying to forget the whole evening had happened. That's when Emily found me again. Dad, can we talk? Something in her voice had shifted. Emily's always been steady, never dramatic, never one for suspense, but there was a weight under that calm I hadn't heard from her before. We walked out to her car together. She didn't start the engine. She just sat there staring at the steering wheel for what felt like a full minute. "Before I show you this," she finally said, "I need you to promise you'll let me finish." Finish what? Promise me. That alone was enough to turn my stomach. My daughter doesn't build suspense for fun. If she was asking me to brace myself, it was because she already knew what it would do to me. I gave her my word. She pulled out her phone and opened a folder full of audio files. Dozens of them. Dated, labeled, going back weeks. "What am I looking at, Emily?" She looked at me straight on for the first time all night. "This is why I asked you to stay tonight." Then she hit play. At first it was just background noise. Glasses clinking, a door somewhere, a distant conversation. Then a clear voice cut through. Vivian's tone was relaxed and easy, nothing like the polished version she wore in public. "4 more weeks," she said. "After that, everything gets easier." Another voice answered, "Gerald." Then Vivian laughed, soft and unbothered. "Preston's the easy part." I sat up straight in that seat like someone had put a hand on the back of my neck. "Once the wedding happens," Vivian continued, "I'll start moving on the property situation. Bob already has interested buyers." I honestly thought for a second I'd misheard her. Property situation. Buyers. I looked at my daughter. She said nothing. She just let the recording keep playing. Gerald's voice stayed level. "And if he says no?" "Vivian," without a beat of hesitation, "he won't. Men like him trust their kids. That's what makes it easy." The inside of that car suddenly felt half its actual size. I could feel my own pulse in my ears. I still wasn't even angry yet. I was completely confused, because none of it made sense to me. My property. Buyers. That certainty in her voice, like she'd already run the math on my entire life and come out ahead. The recording ended. Neither of us said anything for a long time. "Tell me this isn't what it sounds like," I finally managed. "I wish I could," Emily said. Then she opened a second folder. Photos, contracts, screenshots. There's so much of it my head spins just remembering. "How long have you known?" I asked. Her answer hit harder than the recording had. "Long enough to know tonight wasn't an accident." If you've ever had one sentence rearrange every memory you have of a person, birthdays, holiday dinners, all of it suddenly meaning something different, then you know exactly what it felt like sitting in that truck at that moment. The next file wasn't a recording. It was a map, county style, with colored corridors marking parcels of land. Emily zoomed in, and there it was. My feed store and the 6 acres behind it, sitting right in the middle of a highlighted route. "A highway expansion," she said quietly. "Not announced publicly yet. How do you even know that's real?" She pulled up more documents. County planning records, internal proposals, some public, some that clearly had no business being anywhere near her phone. The more she scrolled, the colder I felt in my chest. "Dad, if this corridor gets built, land values along it could jump 6 to 10 times in a few years." Every question Preston had ever asked me about that property came rushing back, and none of it had been curiosity. He'd been building a file on me before he'd ever eaten a meal at my table. "How much money are we talking?" I asked, barely above a whisper. She repeated it, 6 to 10 times, maybe more. I leaned back in my seat and thought about that feed store. 3 generations. Land my grandfather had cleared by hand and refused to walk away from through 2 different bad harvests. To me, that land was home. To somebody else, apparently, it was just a line item. Emily pulled up another file, a chain of emails with names I didn't recognize, talking about development opportunities and acquisition timing. One name kept showing up. Gerald Hale. My jaw locked. He's involved. More than involved. She tapped the screen again, and a scanned document filled it. It took me a few seconds to understand what I was looking at. My name, Robert Callahan, my signature at the bottom. Except it wasn't my signature. What in God's name is this? She didn't answer right away. She opened another one, then another. Every one of them carried some version of a forged signature that was almost identical to mine, close enough to fool a notary, close enough to fool a county recorder's office, but not close enough to fool the man whose hand it was supposed to belong to. "These are fake," I said. "I know exactly whose signature that isn't." "I think you already know who made them." That night, for the first time, something other than confusion started pushing through the anger, real and cold. It wasn't about the money. It was about the arrogance behind it. Somewhere, someone had looked at a man's entire life and decided it could be reduced to paperwork without ever asking him, negotiating with him, or treating him like he had the right to say no. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. "At least a year." I closed my eyes. A year. A year of welcoming Preston into my home, sitting across from him at Sunday dinners, listening to wedding plans and watching my daughter build a future I believed was real, while another plan moved quietly underneath all of it, and nobody had thought to mention it to me. "There's more," Emily said. I opened my eyes. "The worst part isn't what they wanted. It's how far they were willing to go to get it." I thought I was ready for whatever came next. I wasn't. She pulled up a video, grainy, clearly recorded without anyone's knowledge. Gerald Hale, alone in what looked like a home office, papers spread across a desk. Another man walked in. They talked timelines, projected values, acquisition targets. Then Gerald tapped a folder near his elbow, and even from that angle, I could read my own name printed on the tab. "The Callahan parcel is the priority," Gerald said in the recording. "Everything depends on locking down that land before the corridor goes public." The other man asked how confident he felt. Gerald smiled at the camera, not knowing it was there. "Very. Vivian's already done the hard part." I went still. Emily didn't need to say anything else. The evidence spoke for itself, file after file, each new piece adding another layer to a plan that had clearly been building for far longer than anyone in that ballroom had admitted. This wasn't a relationship that had gone wrong. This was an operation that had used a relationship as a way in. That thought hit me harder than anything else that whole night. I'd spent months believing my daughter had simply fallen for the wrong man. The truth was worse. It was very possible Preston's interest in her only started after his family found out what sat on her father's land. "When did you start suspecting her?" I asked. "About 3 months ago." "What changed?" She made a mistake. That caught my attention, because Vivian never struck me as a woman who made mistakes. Emily pulled up one more recording, shorter. Vivian having dinner with a friend, voice easy and confident. Honestly, her father's easier to handle than I expected. Her friend laughed. "You mean Preston?" "No, Bob." Hearing my own name said that way turned my stomach. The daughter asked questions. The father trusts people. That's why it works. After that one ended, neither of us spoke for a while. Vivian had no idea Emily had been close enough to hear any of it. My daughter finally spoke. And more than the money, more than the forged signature, more than any of it, it was that moment I understood exactly how they'd always seen us. Not as people, as variables. Obstacles to move around on the way to a number on a spreadsheet. "Why didn't you confront her the moment you found out?" I asked. "Because I needed proof they couldn't talk their way out of," she said without hesitating. "If I moved too soon, they'd bury the documents, delete the messages, and rewrite the whole story before anyone could stop them. I needed them to think they'd already won. For the first time all night, I saw the full weight of what my daughter had been carrying alone. Weeks of smiling through cake tastings and seating charts, all while quietly building a case against the family she was about to marry into. Most people would have exploded the moment they heard that first recording. Most people would have walked out. Emily hadn't done either. She'd waited, documented, built it piece by piece, brick by brick, until they had nowhere left to hide. "So what's the plan?" I asked. She looked at me with the same expression she'd worn back in that lobby. Calm, certain. "The wedding's tomorrow," she said, "and they think they're about to win." Then she reached into her jacket, pulled out a small flash drive, and pressed it into my hand. "They're not." I drove back to the hotel a little after midnight. Sleep never came close. The flash drive sat on the nightstand, untouched, because I didn't need to look at it again. I'd already seen more than enough to stare at the ceiling until dawn. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Vivian's voice. Every time I opened them, I pictured my feed store sitting in the middle of a highway corridor that hadn't even been announced yet. If you've ever lain awake, turning over one sentence somebody said about you, running it back over and over trying to find an angle that doesn't sting, I can tell you there isn't one. You just get up the next morning and decide what you're going to do about it. Around 8, Emily called and asked me to come by her apartment. When I got there, another man was already set up at the dining table, laptops, cables, a small projector. His name was Marcus, one of Emily's oldest friends, who did audiovisual work for corporate events across the state. "We're almost ready," Emily said, and I understood immediately. The wedding wasn't just a wedding anymore. It was a deadline. Marcus threw a presentation up on the wall, recordings, documents, photos, video clips, arranged in a precise, deliberate sequence, every claim backed by evidence. No guesswork, no emotional appeals, just facts laid out one after another like stepping stones. "Is the venue okay with all this?" I asked. Marcus smiled. "They think it's a surprise slideshow for the groom." I almost laughed. Not because any of it was funny, but because the irony was too obvious to ignore. The Hales thought they were walking into a celebration. In about 6 hours, they'd be walking into the worst day of their lives. Emily kept running the sequence. First the recordings, then the documents, then the forged signatures. "Every reveal is built to land right on top of the last one," she said. Watching her work, I realized how much she'd changed over the past few weeks. The anger was gone. The hurt was gone. What was left was something colder and steadier. Clarity. "You could still walk away from all of this quietly," I said. "You don't owe them a scene in front of 200 people." She was quiet for a moment, eyes fixed on the screen. "If I walk away quietly, they'll just find somebody else to do this too." And somewhere underneath it, I knew she was right. People willing to build an entire engagement on a lie don't stop because one plan fell through. They just look for the next person who trusts too easily. That was the moment my last doubt disappeared. Whatever happened in that room, I was standing beside my daughter every second of it. Just before I left for the ceremony, Emily stopped me at the door. "Dad." I turned around. "Whatever happens today in that room," she said, "don't stop me." And the way she said it told me she already knew exactly how far this was going to go. The ceremony started at 2 o'clock sharp. Every seat in that ballroom was filled. Friends, cousins, business partners, neighbors from 3 counties over, all dressed up and smiling, waiting for a wedding to begin. Nobody in that room had any idea they were about to witness something completely different. Gerald worked the crowd like a man closing a deal, not attending his son's wedding. Vivian smiled for photos, sweet and composed. And Preston, I'll give him this, looked every bit the groom, greeting each guest with that same polished warmth he'd shown for 2 straight years. If he was nervous, he hid it well. Emily stood at the front beside the officiant, calm, unreadable. I've known my daughter her whole life. Most people in that room saw a bride waiting for her groom. I saw a woman waiting to finish something. The music started. Every conversation in the room stopped at once. Preston appeared at the end of the aisle on his father's arm, and the room did exactly what rooms do at weddings. People smiled. A few wiped away tears. Gerald wore the look of a man who believed everything had gone exactly according to plan. Step by step, they walked toward a future that, without most of the people watching realizing it, no longer existed. I want you to hold on to this next part, because I've replayed it more times than I can count, and I think it's the part that stays with people longest. Preston reached the altar, kissed his father's cheek, and took his place beside Emily. The officiant welcomed everyone, and began. For a few minutes, everything unfolded exactly the way 200 guests expected it to. Then came the vows. "Emily Callahan," the officiant said, Do you take Preston Hale to be your lawfully wedded husband? The silence that fell over that ballroom settled like a lid closing on a jar. Emily looked at Preston. He gave her the same smile he'd worn at every family dinner, every holiday, every photograph. The smile that had convinced 2 families and 200 guests that he was exactly who he claimed to be. Then Emily spoke, slow and steady. Before I answer that, there's something everyone in this room deserves to see. Confusion spread instantly. The officiant blinked. Preston's smile faltered by a fraction of an inch, the first crack I'd seen in 2 years. Gerald's head snapped toward the back of the room, and then the screen came alive. At first, nobody understood what they were watching. Vivian, sitting at a restaurant table, her own voice recorded unmistakable, filled the room. 4 more weeks. After that, everything gets easier. Some guests exchanged confused glances, waiting for the punchline. It continued. Once the wedding happens, I'll start working on the property situation. Bob already has buyers lined up. The room went quiet. Every eye moved between the screen and the groom, frozen at the altar. Preston's face went pale in real time. Vivian sucked in a breath. Gerald half rose from his chair, then sat back down like his legs had changed their mind. The second recording started immediately. Gerald's voice. And if he says no, Vivian laughing, he won't. Men like him trust their kids. That's what makes it easy. That's when the gasps started, rolling through the ballroom like a current. People turned fully around in their seats to look at the Hale family. Others turned to look at me. Some just sat frozen where they were, forks halfway to their plates, still on the tables, untouched since the ceremony began. Preston took a step toward Emily. "What is this?" he whispered. She didn't look away from him. The truth. The third recording hit harder than the first 2 combined. Gerald's voice, cold and professional, filled the room. The corridor's approved. That land triples in value. We need control before the announcement goes public. I want to pause here, because this is the part where time really seemed to stretch. I watched the confusion on every face in that room shift, one by one, into understanding. You could almost track it moving table to table, like a wave crossing still water. Shock, disbelief, anger, arriving last and staying the longest. "Turn this off," Gerald shouted, on his feet now. "This is doctored. This is fraud." Nobody moved. The presentation kept going. This time, documents, emails, maps, projections. Then the forged papers, my name at the top of every page, my signature at the bottom of each one. Guests were whispering openly now, several standing, dozens of hands reaching for phones at once. Vivian looked like she might faint. And Preston. Preston was crying, real tears, for the first time since I'd known him. Not because he was sorry, but because he'd lost control of the room, and I don't think he'd ever lost control of a room in his life. "Emily, please," he said. "We can talk about this privately." For the first time since the ceremony began, a real emotion crossed my daughter's face. Not rage, disappointment, which is somehow always worse. "You had 2 years to be honest with me," she said. "You chose this instead." The room went silent again, and then one final slide appeared, a timeline showing that conversations about acquiring my land had started months before Emily and Preston had officially met as a couple. You could feel the room understand instantly that they weren't watching a relationship that had failed. They were watching evidence of a plan that had used a relationship as cover. If you've ever needed a room full of people to finally see what you'd been carrying alone for months, you know there's nothing else in the world like watching every face in that room finally catch up to what you already knew. For a few seconds after that last slide, absolutely nobody moved. Then the whole ballroom broke at once, chairs scraping, voices overlapping, phones lighting up in every direction. Gerald was the first to react, storming toward the back, jabbing a finger at the screen. "Turn it off! Turn it off right now!" Marcus stayed locked in the AV booth. The evidence was already out. There was no taking it back. Gerald squared up to Preston. "You have no idea what you just did." "Actually," Preston said, still as steady as ever, "I do." Vivian sat frozen in her chair, staring at the screen like refusing to blink could undo what she'd just watched. Emily looked worse, mascara running, hands shaking, scanning the room for someone willing to meet her eyes. Instead, she found people looking away. Friends who'd toasted her a week earlier at the bridal shower were suddenly very interested in their own shoes. Then a man near the third row stood up. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't excited. And that calm, more than anything else in the room, was what made people turn toward him. "My name is Dale Whitfield," he said. "I'm an assistant prosecutor for Ashland County." The room went completely silent, even Gerald. "I've been here today as a personal guest. Based on what was just presented, I'd strongly advise the people involved not to leave this building." Whatever hope the Hales had left evaporated on the spot. This wasn't a family scandal anymore. It was a legal matter in front of 200 witnesses. "This is absurd," Gerald snapped. "Maybe," Dale said calmly. "But forged signatures, fraudulent property documents, and conspiracy aren't things I'd recommend walking away from." Vivian took a trembling step toward the aisle like she might bolt for the door. Three of Emily's friends quietly positioned themselves near the exit without touching her, just making it clear that leaving wouldn't be simple. She stopped, looked around, and understood, maybe for the first time in her life, that there was nowhere to go. She sank into a chair and covered her face with her hands. "I want to be honest with you about what I felt watching all of this. I expected fury. What I actually felt was relief, the kind that hits you all at once, like finally letting out a breath you'd been holding. Months of doubt, weeks of quiet dread, years of work tied up in that land. All of it lifted off me at the same time. For the first time since that lobby, I could breathe normal again. 20 minutes later, uniformed officers walked into the ballroom, and every conversation stopped instantly. Every eye went straight to the Hale family. And from the look on Gerald's face, he finally understood that whatever came next was only just beginning. The wedding ended that afternoon. What came after lasted years. Investigators collected everything Emily had gathered: recordings, documents, video, emails. What started as a scene at a wedding turned into a full criminal investigation within days. Forensic audio experts confirmed nothing had been altered. Handwriting analysts confirmed what I already suspected about those signatures. Fake, all of them. The deeper investigators dug, the worse things got for the Hales. Their business accounts were bleeding, loans were stacking up. Investments that had failed years earlier had been quietly buried under more debt. The wealth they projected everywhere they went was thinner than anybody had imagined, and that's when the motive finally made sense to me. They hadn't wanted my land because they were greedy in some abstract way. They needed it because the version of themselves they'd built for the world was already collapsing underneath them. That doesn't excuse what they did. If anything, it explains how far they were willing to go to keep the act going a little longer. Then more people started coming forward. A woman from Kentucky contacted investigators after seeing the story on local news. Years earlier, she'd dated a man connected to the Hales, and the relationship had drifted strangely and specifically toward questions about her family's property before she ended things. Then another person came forward, then another. None of the stories matched exactly, but together they drew the same shape over and over, showing that what happened at that wedding hadn't just ended one plan. It had given other people permission to finally say something they'd been holding on to for years. Months before the case went to trial, the Hales lawyers requested a meeting. Emily and I sat across the table from them, a conference table between us and the center. The offer was simple: a large settlement, a joint statement, and an understanding that we'd stop cooperating with prosecutors. The number was big enough to make anybody pause. I won't pretend it didn't cross my mind. But the longer I sat there, the clearer it became that the offer wasn't really about making things right. It was about making everything disappear before it could cost them anything real. When the lawyer finished his pitch, the room went quiet, everyone waiting on our answer. Emily looked at me. I already had mine. "No," I said. "Can I ask why?" The lawyer said, more like a statement than a question. "Because if we take this," I told him, "another family becomes the next family this happens to." The trial dragged on for a long time. Recordings, documents, financial records, expert testimony, all of it reinforcing itself piece by piece until there was nothing left to argue against. By the time closing arguments came around, I watched something disappear from Gerald Hale's face for good, the certainty that had followed him through every boardroom and dinner in his life. Not all the money in the world, not all the effort in the world, was going to buy that back. The verdict came almost a year after a wedding that never happened. Gerald received the longest sentence. Vivian's testimony was shorter, but long enough to guarantee consequences would follow her for years. Preston sat quietly while his sentence was read, And for the first time since I'd known him, he looked like someone who finally understood that actions carry consequences, and that every consequence eventually arrives, whether you're ready or not. Emily and I walked out of that courthouse together without saying much. There wasn't much left to say. 2 years later, things are different, better. Emily's still working in land management, but lately she spends a lot more time out at the store and the property than in some office downtown. About a year after the trial, she met a man named Theo, a soil conservationist who's never once asked what an acre of our land is worth. The first thing he asked me was how Carol used to make her blackberry cobbler. I knew exactly who he was right then. They got married under the old oaks on our own land. No ballroom, no hidden agendas, no performance, just two people who genuinely cared for each other, standing on the ground my grandfather refused to walk away from. Sometimes I think back to that hotel lobby, the joke about the truck. For a few seconds that night, I felt ashamed of my whole life. Now I understand the insult was never really about me. People who measure a man's worth by his clothes or his job usually end up revealing a lot more about themselves than about you. If you've ever stood in a room where someone looked at you like you didn't matter, I want you to hear this clearly. Their opinion of you isn't a fact. It's a confession about them. The mistake most people make is absorbing that moment as truth, instead of recognizing it as information about the person delivering it. What Emily understood, and what nobody else in that room understood, was that patience isn't the same thing as weakness. Waiting for proof isn't the same thing as staying silent forever. If there's one thing I'd ask you to do today, it's this. The next time your gut tells you something's off about a person, even someone everyone else adores, write it down somewhere. A note, a date, whatever it is. Not to accuse anybody, just so you have it if that moment ever comes. And here's something worth sitting with tonight, long after you've closed this video. Is there someone in your life right now that you've made yourself smaller for, just so they could feel bigger? My land is still here. The trees are still growing. My family's name is still on every acre of that ground. Some evenings I sit on that porch and watch the sun go down over the same fields my father worked, and I remind myself of the one lesson this whole thing taught me for good. Never make yourself small so somebody else can feel tall. I'd love to know what you would have done in Emily's shoes. Drop a 1 in the comments if you think I should have confronted them the moment I found out. A 2, if you think waiting for proof was the right call. Or a 3, if you're honestly still not sure. Tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. I always read those. And if any part of this hit close to home, if you've ever stayed quiet about a suspicion regarding someone everyone else loved, I want to hear that too. Thank you for sticking with me through this one. If stories about family, betrayal, and slow, steady justice mean something to you, stay a while and subscribe. There's another one coming, and I think you're going to want to hear it.